right, have you heard about the new rules that have been proposed by FinCEN to track real estate transfers into limited liability companies and land trusts? Probably not, because they've done this under the radar. They've released new regs, and I'm going to break it down for you in this video and why this is really important. All right, let's get started. Okay, so here's the deal. On February 16th, FinCEN released some new regs proposing to track real estate transfers from individuals or even corporations, whatever it is, into land trusts, into business entities. And they want to track a whole host of new information. I mean, it wasn't like the CTA has been intrusive enough on us. And I think what they've done is they said, hey, let's get everyone focused on the Corporate Transparency Act, and then we're going to sneak this in behind, and we're going to track all real estate transfers in the United States that go into business entities. Now, they're doing this under the guise of, again, money laundering or the Russians. I mean, it's really crazy when you read the proposed regulations, the justifications for imposing these new reporting requirements. Now, in this video, what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to break down exactly what they're intending to do, and I'm going to show you some examples at the end of property transfers that they're going to be tracking, who has to report, what has to be reported, and I'll talk about some ways in which maybe we can possibly work around this or minimize how much we have to be reporting. I'm so frustrated because you're seeing this continual overreach by the federal government into our personal lives, and there is no more privacy from the federal government if they were allowed to keep moving on unchecked. All right, so let's get started now on exactly what I'm referring to here and why you need to be up on this, and you should be reaching out to your congressmen or senators and letting them know enough is enough. So what are they proposing to do? Well, as I stated, they want to track property transfers. And what that means is that any transfer into a reporting entity or a transferee trust. Now, I'm going to break those words down for you here in just a minute. Any transfer into one of these entities. So we're not talking about just a sale. We're talking about what we do all the time, which is deed our property into trusts or limited liability companies. Hey, you're going to have to report on that. And there's no exception as to property value. So what they're tracking now is real estate transfers. So what type of real estate are we talking about that's actually covered by this? Well, it's going to be residential real estate. So 4 units or less. So if you got a duplex, a triplex, a quad, that's going to get tracked under this new proposed regulation. They're also going to be tracking vacant land. So if you just have raw land, you want to transfer that in, that's going to be tracked. And then let's say you've invested into a housing corporation or a cooperative like you have in major cities such as New York. So you don't actually own the deed itself, but you own stock in these cooperatives. Then if you want to transfer that cooperative interest to someone, that is also going to be tracked. So they're very targeted in what they're seeking information on. And it goes hand in hand because for the last, 15 years, FinCEN has been releasing new GTOs. And what that is that they geographically target certain areas in the United States, certain cities, to track real estate property transfers for cash that are over a certain dollar limit. Now, they've been doing this again under the guise of preventing money laundering in the United States. And that program is probably met, based upon my reading, with some success. But the successes that they can point to are the extreme cases. So you haven't caught a lot of people there from my reading, but nevertheless, why not impose an additional burden on all U.S. taxpayers so we can get as much information as we can on them? All right, so what is a transferee entity? Because this is what they're going after now, where they're going to be tracking the transfers into what they define as a transferee entity in the regs. Now, it pretty much mirrors the Corporate Transparency Act as far as a transferee entity, with one exception. So transfers into corporations, limited liability companies, limited partnerships, any entity that is registered with the state is considered to be a transferee entity. And if you deed your property into one of those types of entities, then you're going to have to report. Now, one exception or difference between the CTA and these new regs is that in the CTA, they didn't require reporting on nonprofits. However, FinCEN stated in their proposed regs that a lot of money laundering takes place through nonprofits. So they want to track nonprofits as well under the definition of a transferee entity. Now, in addition to the transferee entity, they added the term transferee trust. So the transferee trust, we're going to explain here in just a moment, that is a new definition or a new entity that they plan to track that was not tracked under the CTA. So what is this transferee trust? Well, if you watch many of my videos on my channel, I talk about land trusts, and land trusts fall within the definition of a transferee trust, as do a living trust. So just think, you have a piece of property and you set up your estate plan. We help you here at Anderson to create a living trust, and you transfer your property into the living trust. That's going to get tracked. We're going to have to report, or you're going to have to report on that transfer, because a transferee trust is not a statutory trust. That's already covered under the CTA or under a transferee business entity, okay? Because that's filed with the Secretary of State. Transferee trusts are grantor trusts, irrevocable trusts, entities that are not recorded anywhere with a state agency. That falls with this all-encompassing definition of a transferee trust. So essentially, if you transfer property into any type of trust agreement, there is going to be reporting. Now, as I stated at the very end, I'm going to get into what has to be reported on these transfers, but I want to lay out for you what they're targeting so you get a good sense of where this law is going. Okay, so here's a little quote from FinCEN in the regs. They said transfers to trust, they recognize are not covered under the CTA. So the CTA did not explicitly provide for tracking of beneficial owner information. So that's why they're including it in this proposed reg. But here's the thing, who cares? Because FinCEN also goes on later on to state that, yeah, we're collecting all these information on transferee business entities under the CTA. However, that's not enough. We need double tracking. So we're going to make people who transfer their own property into a limited liability company not only report under the CTA for their LLC, but also report under this new set of regulations. And it just confuses me or confounds me that, they already have this information. But again, this is the federal government, and they don't know how to pull their own information out of their database. And if you've already applied for your FinCEN identification number, you probably realize that when you applied for it, how simple it was. It made me wonder, are they even checking? I know when I applied for it, I uploaded a copy of my driver's license and I filled out the form and I hit submit and I got a number just like that. I thought, how could they verify my information that quickly on that driver's license that I uploaded? Probably a lot of fraud is going to be taking place with people who want to commit crimes through business entities. This isn't going to deter it, but what the heck? We just keep passing laws expecting a different result. What is that called? Oh yeah, it's insanity. All right, so what types of transactions are not covered under the proposed regulations? Well, transfers of commercial real estate. So for whatever reason, FinCEN has decided that people who want to launder money only buy residential real estate and they won't buy commercial real estate. So that's actually taken out of the definition. And the definition of commercial real estate is more than 4 units. So if you have a 5-plex and above and you transfer it into an LLC or a land trust, that is not going to be tracked. Transfers between individuals. So if you transfer property from yourself to your brother, that's non-reportable. Or if you buy property from another individual and you buy it in your own name, that's not reportable. But if you take that property you bought from someone else, hold it in your name, and then you transfer it into a trust, that will be reportable, as are transactions in which you use financing. So if you're using financing with a bank, for instance, and you're going to take title in a trust or a business entity, that type of transaction where you're using bank financing will not be tracked. You do not have to track or report on that because they figure they already have enough information from that transaction from the bank that's reporting on it that they don't need to track that particular transaction. Transfers of entities, okay, will not be tracked, which I thought was kind of odd because in the regs, they talk about tracking housing cooperatives, but if you already have your property inside of a limited liability company or a land trust, for example, with a lot of the flips that I do personally, I typically will put that property into a limited liability company, then I flip the LLC to the investor. So with my business going forwards, I'm going to continue to do that so that my investor clients who buy my properties continue to buy the LLC, and the LLC transfer is not tracked. Of course, unless they change the regs, maybe I shouldn't have said that because they might do it. But the fact of the matter is I found that to be odd that they only want to track housing cooperatives, but not transfers of real estate that is held by a limited liability company or a trust. So if it's already in there, all right, if you've already set up structures and you have property and trust, and this is one of the reasons why I think I'm going to be leaning more into using land trusts in the future, because once a property is inside of a land trust, you can move it anywhere you want, and those types of transfers are not tracked under the proposed regulations. So think on that. It's another strategy that I'll be talking about in future videos, the importance of using land trusts on an ongoing basis to hold title to our real estate. Now, transfers due to death, bankruptcy, divorce, things like that, or estate planning, those types of transfers do not have to be tracked as well. So if your parents pass away, they have a house, and you transfer that house into an LLC, then I would assume that that transfer does not need to be tracked, because they specify that any types of transfers as a result of that are not trackable. So, in my estate plan, you might put this: hey, when I pass away, if I own any real estate in my own name, prior to passing it on to my children, I want it to be transferred into a land trust or into a limited liability company. Therefore, when they receive it, then it's going to be, they don't have to report on it. And if they turn around and transfer that interest later on to another entity, that won't be reportable. But you can see what can happen here. Let's say that your parents pass away, you inherit their house, and so now you transfer that property to you, not reportable. Then you decide you want to take that house and turn it into a rental. So you take that property and you move it into a limited liability company or a land trust. That is reportable. So here's the strategy. If you want to get ahead of it, then what you should do through an estate plan is transfer all of the real estate that is not already held inside of a business entity into a business entity. A land trust is actually what I would do. Put it into a land trust, then provide the land trust to the beneficiaries. Then they can do whatever they want with that into the future. Okay, so that's what's not covered. Let's go on to the next one. So who's going to get reported on? All right, so owners of business entities, just like the Corporate Transparency Act. So if you have a limited liability company and you transfer your real estate into that limited liability company, then you're going to have to report on the beneficial owners. And it just mirrors the CTA as far as 25% or more of the beneficial owners of that. Now, they're also going to report on trusts. And again, I got a lot of diagrams to break all this down here towards the end of the video. We're going to get into that. But just as an overview, they're going to track on trusts. And this is where it gets really intrusive into trusts that have been set up, because they're going to track information on who is the trustee. So this is particularly concerning for myself, because if I'm serving as a nominee trustee on someone's land trust, then under the regulations, when that deed is signed, then they're going to, I will have to report as a trustee my personal information, as you're going to find out. They're going to talk about if your trust has a director or a trust protector. So some trusts are set up with these positions inside of them. So if you have a trust that has been established like that, and typically you're going to find that in an asset protection trust, Nevada asset protection trust. So those parties are going to have to be reported on. And see, this is probably going to have a somewhat chilling effect on the trust industry now, because namely way a lot of trusts are set up for asset protection purposes, you're using a trust protector or someone else like that to ensure that it comports with the state law in which the trust is established in for those asset protection benefits. But at the same time now, you're putting that trustee in a position where they need to report their involvement to the federal government. So we'll see how this works out if this law is not overturned. Hopefully it's going to be overturned, like what happened in the recent Alabama court case where they held the CTA to be unconstitutional with respect to the Small Business Association. We'll see if this does go into effect, if someone's able to get in front of it and stop it as well. All right, so any beneficiary. Now this is where the law differs from the CTA and tracking business entities. So when it comes to trusts, every beneficiary will be listed, or their information will be provided to FinCEN. So if you set up a land trust, for instance, and you list yourself as to 90% interest, and you have 5 kids, and you give each child a 2% interest in that trust, then not only will your information, be reported, but each of your children's information will all be sent into FinCEN, because they do not distinguish based upon beneficial ownership in trusts in the regs. So all beneficiaries' information has to be reported on under this proposed regulation. The grantor of the revocable trust, that is the person that set up the trust, is going to be reported on. And then, as I stated, basically anybody that has any control or that can receive any benefit, any income out of the trust, even if they're not listed as an immediate beneficiary, but they're able to receive something, they also have to be reported on. So it tells me, in looking at the legislation here or proposed regulations, that what they're thinking is that money launderers are creating trusts and pulling money out the side. And so they want to make sure they're going to be reported on. Let me think. If I was going to launder money, yeah, I'm going to comply with this, right? So fact of the matter is, again, we think we can pass a law and it's going to change things. It's not going to change human behavior. People will figure out a way around this. All right. What about ongoing reporting? Now, this is interesting, and I was looking for this particularly when I was reading through these proposed regs, because under the Corporate Transparency Act, as you should know, if you don't, I've cut a video on this as well, that whenever the beneficial ownership changes in a limited liability company, or your personal information changes, or your driver's license expires, you're required within a set amount of time, 15, 30 days, to update FinCEN with that new information. So for example, if I had a limited liability company and I transferred that limited liability company to a third party, then that entity would need to update FinCEN with the new beneficial owners. Now, with the real estate reporting here that we have under these proposed regulations, they have not adopted the same process. In fact, they addressed it. They figured it'd be too overly burdensome to track the changes of entities in the future that hold real estate. So if I transfer an interest into a land trust, and this is why I told you transfers of land trusts and limited liability companies are currently not tracked under the proposed regs. If I put a property into a land trust and then I move that land trust to a new beneficiary, let's say, for example, I move it to a limited liability company, which is typically how we structure land trusts for asset protection. When I move it into that LLC, that does not get reported. So it just reported going in. And then once it's in, wherever that thing goes from there, there is no reporting involved with these transfers, unlike the Corporate Transparency Act. And they kind of stated too is that, hey, if it's going into an LLC, we're already picking up some of that information on the Corporate Transparency Act if there's changes. So we don't feel that we need to impose the same type of tracking that we have under the CTA for these real estate transfers. All right. So who's required to submit the report? Now, this is the interesting thing. So with reporting, I'm telling you that you have to submit this information to FinCEN. And so what they did is they went through and they put together a laundry list of individuals in order of responsibility for submitting the report. Now, a lot of the beginning portion here are people responsible or individuals that would be involved in a purchase and sale transaction. So if I had a trust or a limited liability company and I was going through a purchase and sale, I was buying property for cash from an investor or maybe just, a third party, then the people involved in that transaction are going to be responsible for collecting the information on the beneficial owners, the names of entities, and all the stuff I'm about to show you. So what they did in the regulations is they said, all right, here's a bunch of people that are going to have responsibility here for collecting this information. And if they're not involved in that transaction, then you just go to the second one. If you don't have person 1 and 2, then you go to the third one. So what they've outlined for you is that you have the first person is called a real estate professional. And that's the person who is provide the settlement services, that it's going to sign off on the HUD and handles the entire transaction at the title company or escrow company, whoever's dealing with that. They're going to be responsible primarily for reporting. Now, they can agree with other parties that, hey, I'm not going to do this. Somebody else is going to do this. So we're going to say, all right, I'm going to kick this down to my title insurer, the underwriter that handles the title insurance. So then that company would be responsible for reporting. And if that person doesn't want to do it, then the buyer, the person who disperses the most funds in the transaction, will then take on that responsibility. So what do I mean by that? So let's assume that you're a private party sale and you're not going to be using a title company here. You're just doing a cash deal and you say, I don't need title. I'm just going to take care of this on my own. I don't know why you would do that, but let's assume that happened. And you didn't put the money in escrow and you just did a cash transaction. Well, if I'm the one buying it under the cash transaction, then I will be the party responsible to report on this information or collect this information and report it to FinCEN because I dispersed the funds. Now, what's interesting is that if you have a joint venture, let's say there's two parties involved and we're going to buy this property as a JV. Maybe it's going to be a TIC, for example, and we have two limited liability companies that are coming into the TIC to buy the property. Well, under the regs, the party that pays the most cash in the deal is the responsible reporting party. So you better think about that on your next TIC deal, that if you don't have any of these other parties that are willing to do the reporting, then it's going to fall on one of your shoulders to make sure this information gets submitted. All right, now in addition to that, they threw in another definition, the person who evaluates status of title. So this is kind of a vague one that really is, I think, is all encompassing, that it's just trying to say, like, whoever's involved in this transaction looking at title to see if it's got clear title, evaluating it, then they need to report. So if the buyer's not reporting, the underwriter's not reporting, the real estate professional's not reporting, well, then this guy's going to do it. Now, for most transfers, right, that we typically deal with our clients here at Anderson, we're helping them move their real estate into a land trust or into a limited liability company. So all of those previous individuals that I just mentioned, they're not involved in that transaction because you own the property. So why would you involve a title insurer or a real estate professional in that type of transaction? You're not. And there is no buyer because you're not buying the property. So this is where I find it to be really interesting. Now where they put the burden is on the person who prepares the deed. So what that means in this scenario is that when I'm transferring real estate into a land trust for a client, most of the time we're preparing those deeds for our clients. So that burden now will fall on Anderson to collect this information and report it on to FinCEN on the entities that are involved in the transaction, who the beneficial owners are. Now, if we're not doing that deed, but some third party, a title company is preparing the deed for you, or you're preparing the deed yourself, well, that burden's going to fall upon you. And this is, again, the one that really makes sure that they will have reporting here, because somebody has to prepare a deed. And the person that's doing the preparing is now going to be the responsible individual to provide the report to FinCEN on the beneficial owners of this particular transaction. Okay, so as I told you, I have some examples, and I think this is really where you can start to get a grasp for the intrusiveness of what they're doing and just the sheer amount of information that they're requesting to be collected by the reporting party and then submitted to FinCEN. So let's assume that we have an individual that's transferring property to a business entity. Okay, this could be a sale, or it could be you just transferring property into your own limited liability company. Now, in this case, what would happen is you need to report on the person making the transfer. So if I bought it from someone for cash and I'm not using financing, then I have to collect their name, date of birth, home address, and social security number. So I need to collect all of that and report on it. In addition to that, I'm going to have to report on the property. So I have to give the property address and the legal description for the property that's being transferred into this entity. In addition to that, because it's a limited liability company, we have to make sure that we're reporting on beneficial owners that own more than 25% or more of that company. So they're going to get reported on. You have to report on the limited liability company. So you got to give it its name, its business address, its EIN number. And then on top of that, we also have to report on whoever's signing on behalf of that business entity on this property deal. So as you can see, this is a ton of information that has to be collected and then reported. Now, do I think this is going to have a chilling effect on some real estate transfers? Absolutely, especially for subject to buyers. Now you're going to need to be collecting information on the seller that you're going to be reporting to FinCEN, and they have to be made aware of that. Hey, I need your social security number. I need this information because when you transfer me to this property, I got to report you. And some people may think that, oh, well, then transferring it to you is not something I want to do because I don't want to report, not realizing that it doesn't matter who they transfer it to. If there's no financing involved, there will be reporting on them. So just keep that in mind if you're involved in subject twos. And I got another strategy for you as well to be aware of. Okay, now entity to business entity. So let's say that you're transferring property from one LLC to another LLC, or you're buying it from another limited liability company. Well, in that case, it's all the same from the property to the individuals like I just showed you on the previous slide. But then because the transferor is a limited liability company, well, then you're going to collect information on that LLC as well and report on it. Okay, what about transfers to trusts? Now, just like again with the transfer into a business entity, we're going to collect the information on the transferor, all right, whoever's signing the deed to transfer their real estate. We're going to collect information on the real estate. And now with the trust, here's where things are going to get very intrusive. So one of the things you're going to have to report on, as I stated earlier, is all of the trust beneficiaries. You have to provide information on them, where they live, social security number, whether or not they're a U.S. citizen, probably a copy of their driver's license, although it wasn't really clear on that, but I assume that's also going to be required. So the beneficiaries go up there. In addition to that, you have to report on the trustee of the trust. All that information as well is going to be collected: date of birth, address, social security number. And then you actually have to report on the trust itself and potentially the grantors as well if you read the regs. So I can just imagine what this reporting form is going to look like whenever a trust is involved. It's going to be 5 pages long because there are multiple parties that can be involved inside of a trust agreement, and you're going to have to be reporting on every single one of them. Now, what comes to mind when I read the regulations and the information reporting on a trustee? So what's particular concern for me, as I stated earlier, I am a nominee trustee on thousands upon thousands of trusts. And many people who set up land trusts do so because they want to keep their information private. That is, they don't want their name on title. So when you're setting up a land trust, we'll set it up with, in what we've done here at Anderson, I'll say Clint Coons, trustee of the Red Frog Trust. And then the client will deed property into that trust where I'm listed as a trustee, but then I resign and I turn that control over to them. They take over as a trustee, but that information isn't uploaded anywhere. That means it's all private because trusts are private documents. So on title, if somebody's looking, it'll just say Clint Coons, trustee of the Red Frog Trust. And they don't actually know that my clients, all right, Ted and Jan, are actually the trustees of this trust because of that privacy feature. Now, under the proposed regulations, I have to report my information to FinCEN. But when I resign, because that's a change, my clients don't have to report the fact that they're now the trustee. However, their information will already be reported because they're listed as the beneficiaries. So here's something that I'm probably going to have to change with my trust, and it's something you're going to want to consider if you're involved in subject to transactions. Now, normally the way the process works is that when we transfer real estate into a land trust where we're using a nominee trustee, the client will sign the deed, send in the deed, and then to our office, and then we'll submit it for recording. When that deed goes out for recording, I will typically resign my position as the nominee trustee at that point in time. Well, because I was the trustee of the trust at the time the deed was signed, then I am going to have to report my information to FinCEN under this proposed regulation. So how do I get around that? Well, what I'm going to have to do now is resign before the client actually signs the deed. So we'll set up the trust, we'll sign it, the client's a beneficiary, I'm listed as a trustee, I'm going to resign my position, appointing my clients now as the trustees, then I'll tell my clients to deed the property into the trust. It'll still go into my name because that's the trust name, how trust title is held, and it won't go into my client's name, so they'll get anonymity, but I will not have to report on myself because I am not the acting trustee at the time in which the deed was signed. Now, from a subject to standpoint, this is where I want to tell you how you may want to change your subject to deals. So knowing that, all right, a lot of investors who deal in subject twos will take the property that they're buying from a distressed homeowner and they'll take the title in from the distressed homeowner into a land trust where the distressed homeowner is listed as the initial trustee. Now, the reason they do that is because they don't want to alert the bank to the fact there's been a property transfer and run the risk that the bank's going to accelerate the mortgage. So if I was buying property from John, I would put John on as the trustee of my land trust. And then after he deeded the property over to the trust, I'd make sure he signs a resignation, provides me with the trustee's deed as well. He's off the trust at that point in time. I'm listed as a trustee. However, from the bank's perspective, title perspective, it'll continue to read John. So John as a transferor, and then John as a transferee, trustee of his trust. Now, under the proposed regulations, this is going to be a problem for people, I think, in subject to transactions. Because now when you enter into that transaction, you're going to have to tell the seller, hey, I need all this information from you because I need to report you as the trustee of this trust that I'm asking you to sign on. I think that's going to have a chilling effect on some of these deals. So here's what I propose. If you're getting involved in a subject to transaction, what I would do now is I would ask John again to be the trustee. And just like I'm planning to do, you have John resign before he signs the deed. So when he resigns, the client, or if you're involved in this transaction, say you're set up as the successor trustee, you automatically become that trustee. So when you're reporting to FinCEN on yourself. That's what you'll be doing. You're not going to be reporting on John. So I think that's one way to work around this for subject to investors. If you're concerned about that seller not wanting to provide his information on this type of transaction. Now, there's other things you can do too, is if you don't want to be your own successor trustee, you want to use a limited liability company, that works as well. You can use an LLC as a trustee. You just have to report on the LLC. But whatever you're going to do there, those transactions will need to get picked up. Now, here's something else to look at. A lot of times when we set up land trusts, we'll set them up, we'll have the client or the person that owns the property listed as the initial beneficiary of the trust. And the reason we do this is because land trusts are not recorded anywhere, so it's a private document. Now, there are sometimes situations where individuals will create land trusts and they'll list the LLC as the beneficiary. Now, why are they doing that? Well, because if you have property in a state other than Florida, you know that land trusts do not offer asset protection. So if you transfer your property, your rental property, into a land trust where you're listed as the beneficiary and you maintain your beneficial ownership in your own name and something goes wrong with that property, well, if somebody sues, they're going to sue the trust and then they can go after the beneficiaries and hold them personally liable. Now, we don't want that. I mean, why set up the trust other than just anonymity? You want asset protection. So what you're going to be doing is transferring that trust into an LLC for that asset protection shield that the LLC provides. Now, if you've set up your trust with the LLC as the initial beneficiary, then the reporting, I think, is going to get even more somewhat complicated, because when you fill out the information to send in to FinCEN, not only will you report on the trust that you're the grantor, that you're the trustee because your nominee trustee reside on the trust itself, but now you're going to have to report on the LLC as the beneficiary. If you don't want FinCEN to know that your land trusts that hold property are owned by specific limited liability companies, then I would encourage you not to list your LLC as an initial beneficiary of a land trust. In fact, that's one of the standard operating procedures here at Anderson, is that we typically list our clients. Once we've transferred the property into the land trust, then we transfer the land trust into the LLC. And as I brought up earlier, that transfer of the land trust into the limited liability company is not reportable. Only the transfer into the trust gets reported. So that's another planning strategy around how you're setting up your structures, that if this regulation goes into effect, I would not list LLCs as the initial beneficiaries, just so that they don't have this additional information. Because again, they're collecting way too much on us, and we need to temper it back and find ways not to provide it. All right, so in addition to this, how about an individual to a trust? Okay, so when you put the property into the trust, and we're using that LLC as a trustee, just like with an individual serving as a trustee, in this scenario with an LLC, you're going to have to report on that limited liability company. So the name of the entity, the business address, and its EIN. And you have to specify the name of the person signing on behalf of that LLC. So here's something that I thought of when I read the regs on this one. So if I'm setting up a land trust and I'm serving as a trustee as an individual, then I have to provide my name, my social security number, my home address, my date of birth, if I'm the trustee. However, if I set up my trust, again, use a nominee trustee or not, and I use an LLC that I've set up in Wyoming that provides me anonymity, now I don't have to provide as much information. More particularly with that LLC, I do not have to provide the beneficial ownership information. So I have to tell them about the LLC's name and its EIN and its business address, but I do not have to report on the owners of the limited liability company. So here's just a little wrinkle there in the regs is that if you're using an LLC to serve as a trustee, you don't have to tell them who the owners are. But if you're using an LLC to be a beneficiary, then you do have to tell them who the 25% or greater owners are in that limited liability company. Kind of odd, but that's the way it was set up. Now, trust to a business entity. So if you're transferring property from a trust to a business entity, well, just like I said, you have to provide information on the transferor. The regs actually specifically call out transferor trust. They define this term. So they talk about transferee trustee. They talked about transferee business entities. And then as you read down through it towards the end of what needs to be reported, they throw out this new term called transferor trust. And they stated that if the property is coming from a trust, then just like the transferee trust, we want to know everything about the trust that's making the transfer. So if you had property in a living trust and you then take that property and you move it over to a limited liability company, and it's not because of death or divorce and things that I talked about, so you're just transferring it over, then you're going to have to report all this information on your living trust as well. So for some reason, they feel that finding out information on the trusts that make the actual transfer is really important. So that information is all going to get collected. All right. In addition to that, there's some other reporting here you have to be aware of. I know this video is kind of long, but there's just so much unpacked in these regs. And I'll put a link to the actual regs in the show notes so you can go and read them themselves if you have a bunch of time to kill. I've reread them probably 5 times, just getting a flavor for what they're trying to accomplish here. And I'll get down to the end and I'll explain that I can't figure it out yet. But here's the point. So not only do you have to report on the beneficial owners, as I've been hinting at, you have to report on the property itself. Now, when we talk about the property, and what it just goes beyond not just the address and the legal description, they want to know the financial aspects of the transaction. So if you paid anything for this property, that information will also need to be provided. Not only if you paid anything, they want to know where the money came from, how it was paid. Did you pay in cash? Did you pay in a wire transfer? So this really goes to the aspect of when you're buying real estate from someone else and you're buying it in a land trust or an LLC. If you're just transferring property, you're not paying any consideration, so there's nothing to report on. But when you're buying real estate, as I like to, a lot of times I buy for cash, in those situations, I'm going to have to report on those cash purchases and let them know where my money's coming from. You have to report on the financial institution, the account number, so they're going to collect that. They're going to know about your bank, your account number. I mean, that's getting pretty intrusive here. How much consideration were paid, and if you used any hard money loans or private loans to fund the transaction, you got to report on those. So just think about this if you're a private lender now. Now you're gonna be reported on any money you're loaning to people to buy property. They're gonna have to collect information on you to report that to FinCEN. I mean, the impact on the real estate industry as a result of this, I think, is going to be pretty dramatic, because people now are going to be having to turn over information when all they're doing, the example I gave you, is just financing a transaction. Oh, well, now because you're not a bank, you have to give that over to the federal government. Again, contact your congressmen, your senators, and say, this is overreach. This is way outside the bounds of what a governmental agency should be allowed to do. Again, it's all under the guise of, hey, there's a Russian behind every corner. There's all this money laundering. I mean, the government has taken those types of situations like they did with the Terrorist Act and taking it and saying, well, we have a blank check now to spy on American citizens and collect any information we want. Even we don't have proof of it, but we can go on a fishing expedition to see whether or not something's there. All right. So what's not required to report? We've been talking about when you have to report. If you transfer property between individuals, no reporting's there. If you transfer, as I stated earlier, a beneficial ownership in a trust or an LLC to another trust or to another limited liability company, you don't have to report those types of transfers. Only transfers of shares in a housing cooperative have to be tracked. If you use traditional bank financing, so if I'm buying a property in the name of my limited liability company, that's not going to be tracked as long as I'm using traditional bank financing to put the deal together. Now, here's my last point in all this, okay? The foolish reasons for this. So when I was reading through the regs and the proposed regulations there, and starts off with all the reasons why they feel they need to implement this. And I started noting some provisions or some aspects of the regs that I looked at and I started scratching my head and said, this is stupid. Number one, we don't know if this will work or provide any benefit. Okay, again, if you want to read this, I've put the page number where you can find it in there. I thought to myself, so we're going to pass something that may not even work, and it's going to put a huge burden on people, and we don't know if it's even beneficial to do this. Well, actually you do, because you've had those targeted GTO areas for a number of years, and so you should have data to tell you whether or not it works, or maybe you just increase the information reporting in the GTO areas and run a test pilot of it and see whether or not it makes any difference in money laundering or sneaky Russians getting into our country and buying real estate. But no, we don't want to do that. Better to come out with a hammer and just clobber everyone that transfers real estate into their own private trusts or limited liability companies, because we don't even know a problem yet that we're trying to solve for. The other thing is the information is already collected by the IRS on form. Oh, it says of for. So, hey, guys, before you throw this in the show notes or the comments, Clint, you misspelled this. Well, I didn't actually misspell it, but you used the wrong grammar. Yes, I realize that now when I'm looking at the slide. So leave those comments off, please. So on form 1099-S, but we can't get it from them. So here's what they stated as well. Yes, we understand that when property is sold, many times a 1099-S form is submitted to the IRS. And so if you bought property through an LLC and you're going through traditional closing, that information is collected. However, we're unable to pull that information from the IRS. So even though we have it with the federal government, we don't know how to retrieve it. So rather than figure out our own processes internally and fix them, we're just going to put this burden upon you, and you just provide us the information and do our job for us. Now, this goes hand in hand with the next rationale here. Or not even rationale, just another stupid reason that they brought up is the fact that, hey, we have this information collected under the Corporate Transparency Act, and so we know all about these entities, so you shouldn't need to report it again. However, because money laundering can take place with real estate, we need to collect even more information that we got with the CTA that's currently been implemented and really hasn't even worked its way through the system yet. So what it tells me, it reminds me of, is several years ago under the Obama administration, one of the things that they were concerned about was anonymity with the formation of business entities, such as LLCs that you can set up in Wyoming or Delaware. And the state doesn't collect any information on who the members or managers of. And so it was with the same rationale to stop money laundering, they wanted to ensure that registered agents keep information on who the initial managers and members are, or shareholders and directors of companies that they set up. And so our company actually met with the IRS. They came into our Nevada office and we had a conversation with them and showed, what goes on. And during that conversation, we asked them, we said, we don't understand when you say you don't have this information. When we set up an LLC, we apply for an EIN number. And when we apply for that EIN number for that limited liability company, we provide you the owner's social security number. So you do know who the owner is of these entities, even though the state doesn't list their name. And this is what we were told. Yes, we have it, but we don't know how to access it in our system. So that's why we're requiring other people to do the work for us. That pretty much sums up, in my opinion, what all of this legislation's about, or not legislation, regulations are about. Inept government officials that can't figure out what's going on in their own house. And so they're reaching down and requiring us as real estate investors to do their work for them. Again, hey guys, if you like this video, be sure to smash the like button. I know it was longer than most of my videos, but I think this is really important. If you know of real estate investors and they're not up on this, be sure to share the link to this video to them so they can get themselves educated. I will keep you updated as I am following the regulations and seeing how they progress through there. They're in a comment period right now. I assume if it follows the CTA, they'll come out with revised regulations. Hopefully you don't watch this video because maybe they'll make some changes based upon the strategies that I shared with you. But nevertheless, I'll keep you up to date on it. It's just another area, again, that we just have to push back and ensure that they quit intruding into our personal business affairs. Take care.